The first thing Mary noticed was how the wind seemed to hate her arrival. Snow slammed against the windshield, frantic and sideways, turning the mountain road into a shaky tunnel. The wipers squeaked back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the white blur outside. Her fingers ached around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, as if she could grip the past and not just plastic. Somewhere below the storm and the miles, her sister Susan was still dead, and Mary was still running. The GPS had gone silent 20 minutes ago, replaced by a dull gray, no-signal message. Mary drove on anyway, following half-remembered directions and the shaky scribbles on a crumpled, sticky note. Susan's handwriting stared up at her from the passenger seat, curved and confident, like she had never doubted a single road. Mary swallowed, forcing her eyes back to the glowing headlights and the narrowing curve ahead. If she missed the turn, it would almost feel deserved, like the mountain was finally doing what life hadn't finished. Her suitcase clattered softly in the back as the car hit another patch of ice. Inside the suitcase, everything she owned now fit into 3 neat piles and one messy one. Clothes on one side, documents on the other, and the mess reserved for the things she couldn't name. A photo album she almost left behind, a sweater that still smelled faintly of chalk dust and whiteboard cleaner, retirement papers, funeral brochures, and the key to a cabin that no longer belonged to its original owner. The sign for the town appeared suddenly, half buried in snow, like it had been trying to hide all winter. "Welcome to Silver Ridge," it read, the letters faded, but still stubbornly there. Mary slowed the car, not because she wanted to, but because the road demanded caution now. Beyond the sign, the town lights glowed softly through the storm, fragile but insistent. For a second, she imagined Susan driving this same road, humming, fearless, alive. Her chest tightened as she turned onto the main street, tires crunching over the heavy snow. Most of the storefronts were dark, their signs swinging lightly in the aggressive wind. One diner still glowed warm and yellow, like a stubborn ember refusing to die out. Mary's stomach twisted with hunger, but the thought of walking into a room full of strangers felt unbearable. She passed the diner, eyes fixed ahead, promising herself she could eat once she was invisible again. The cabin's driveway appeared after a sharp curve, nearly swallowed by drifts of snow. She almost missed it, slamming on the brakes when the mailbox with Susan's old number flashed by. The car skidded, fishtailing before grudgingly coming to a stop at the mouth of the drive. Breathless, Mary stared at the narrow path leading upward, barely carved into the hill. Every part of her wanted to turn around, but there was nowhere else to go anymore. She eased the car up the incline, tires protesting, until the cabin finally emerged from the shadows of the pines. It was smaller than she remembered from the photos, the roof thick with snow, the porch sagging slightly. One upstairs window glowed dimly from an automatic timer Susan had set long ago. The sight of that light hit Mary harder than the funeral, sharper than the last phone call. It looked like the house had been expecting someone else, and she was an interruption. Mary turned off the engine, and silence crashed in, loud and immediate. The ticking of the cooling motor was the only sound at first, small and nervous. Outside, the storm roared, but inside the car everything felt sealed and almost safe. Her hand hovered over the door handle, trembling, as if crossing this threshold would finalize something. She drew in a shaky breath and stepped out into the biting cold, carrying her guilt into Susan's world. The front steps were slick with ice, the wood creaking under her cautious weight. Mary steadied herself on the railing, feeling the rough grain press against her palm. She searched for the right key on the ring, each one tiny, silver, and accusing. When the lock finally clicked, it sounded too loud, like she had broken into someone else's story. She pushed the door open and was met with a breath of stale air and silence. The cabin smelled like dust, pine, and something faintly familiar that she couldn't place at first. It wasn't quite perfume and not quite soap, but a clean, simple scent that whispered of Susan. The living room was small, with a couch pressed against one wall and a stone fireplace opposite. Books lined a set of shelves, some leaning, some stacked, most wearing little yellow sticky notes. Mary's chest ached at the sight of Susan's handwriting everywhere, like echoes pinned to pages. She set her suitcase down by the door, unsure where to stand, where to breathe. The quiet in the cabin felt thick, strange, as if it were waiting for the right person to arrive. Her own footsteps sounded wrong against the wooden floor, a borrowed rhythm in an old song. She ran her fingers along the back of the couch, tracing the fabric as if it might explain things. Nothing did. The room just stared back at her, full of artifacts but empty of answers. On the coffee table, a mug sat upside down on a coaster, as if paused mid-routine. Beside it lay a worn notebook with a pen tucked neatly inside the spiral binding. Mary opened the notebook and saw hiking routes, grocery lists, half-finished sentences about the weather. A small doodle of a mountain range decorated the corner of one page, playful and confident. She shut the notebook quickly, as if she'd stumbled into a private conversation she wasn't allowed to hear. In the kitchen, the same story waited for her in different shapes. A grocery list pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tiny red boot, spices lined up in a row, labels facing out, a small army of ordinary comforts. A single tea bag rested near the sink, still in its wrapper, ready for it tomorrow that never came. Mary's hand hovered over it, then pulled back, as if using it would erase something important. She made her way down the short hallway, flipping on lights one by one. The bulbs hummed softly, revealing pictures on the walls she had never seen before. Susan at the lake, Susan on a trail, Susan laughing with strangers Mary didn't recognize. The images felt like proof of a life that had branched away quietly while Mary wasn't looking. Each frame stung, a reminder of every call she hadn't returned quickly enough. When she reached the small bedroom that was now supposed to be hers, she hesitated. The bed was made, crisp and neat, a folded quilt resting at the foot like an invitation. A lamp on the nightstand cast a soft, warm circle on the wooden surface. Her suitcase looked too harsh and foreign dropped there beside the carefully curated calm. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, and the weight of the house's silence pressed down on her. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from a restless, shallow sleep. Mary blinked, disoriented, the early morning light leaking faintly through the curtains. For a moment she forgot where she was, expecting the old Arizona sun and familiar walls. Then the scent of pine and cold and someone else's life settled back into her awareness. The knock came again, gentler this time, as if the visitor knew the house was grieving. She shuffled to the front door, wrapping a sweater tight around her shoulders. Peeking through the small window, she saw a woman bundled in a thick blue coat. The woman held a covered basket in gloved hands, steam faintly rising in the morning chill. Her hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a loose braid, face open and patient. When their eyes met through the glass, the woman smiled as if they already knew each other. Mary cracked the door open, letting in a rush of icy air and unfamiliar kindness. "Morning," the woman said, her voice warm, carrying the cadence of long winters and small towns. "I'm Helen, from the cabin down the hill. Susan was my friend." The word was landed like a small stone in Mary's stomach, heavy and undeniable. Before Mary could reply, Helen held out the basket, as if this were the most natural thing. "I brought some fresh bread," Helen continued, lifting the cloth to reveal a golden loaf. "It's kind of a tradition here when someone arrives, or when someone leaves, or both." Steam curled up between them, fragrant and comforting, smelling like safety in childhood kitchens. Mary's throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't trust her voice to cooperate. She nodded instead, accepting the basket with hands that felt clumsy and undeserving. "Thank you," she finally managed, the words tiny compared to the weight behind them. Helen's eyes softened, scanning Mary's tired face but not lingering too long. "I know this must be a lot," Helen said, choosing each word carefully, like stepping stones. "If you need anything, I'm just down the hill." The greenhouse with the wind chimes. Mary wanted to say she needed less air, less memory, less everything, but she stayed quiet. Helen glanced over Mary's shoulder, into the dim cabin behind her. "It's funny," Helen murmured. "Susan always said this house felt too big for one person." She gave a small, almost apologetic smile, as if she'd revealed a secret too soon. Mary felt a flicker of irritation and grief twist together, sharp and confusing. What did it matter what Susan had said when she wasn't here to say anything anymore? Sensing the shift, Helen took a small step back from the door. "I won't keep you," she added gently, adjusting her scarf around her neck. "But the roads get icy in the afternoons, so if you're heading into town, go earlier." Mary nodded again, the basket warm against her chest, words still hiding behind her teeth. As Helen walked away through the snow, the smell of bread lingered, refusing to be ignored. By midday, the car refused to start, as if it too had decided she'd gone far enough. Mary turned the key, again and again, rewarded only with a strained, helpless, clicking sound. Steam puffed from her lips in the cold garage as frustration rose hot under her skin. She had planned to drive into town, to at least pretend she could control something. Instead, she sat there staring at her reflection in the windshield, feeling stranded in every way. Remembering Helen's warning about the roads, Mary finally pulled out her phone. The signal flickered weakly, barely clinging to a single bar at the edge of reception. A quick search brought up the number for Tom's Auto and Repair, the only shop in town. She hesitated before dialing, irrationally afraid of sounding helpless to yet another stranger. Then she hit call, listening to the ring echo faintly through the near-empty cabin. Tom's Auto, a voice answered, rich and upbeat, like a radio host who knew everyone listening. Mary cleared her throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd spoken at length. "Hi, this is Mary. I'm at Susan Carter's old place," she said, the words tasting strange. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that carried recognition. "Oh," the man replied softly. "Yeah, I know the place. I'm sorry for your loss." He didn't linger on the sympathy, didn't let it turn into a long, awkward silence. "So, what's the car doing or not doing?" he asked, slipping back into practical tone. She described the stubborn engine and the cold garage, her voice steadier now. Tom promised to come up the hill within the hour if the roads held steady. Mary hung up, feeling oddly relieved, as if she'd just passed a small, invisible test. When the tow truck finally appeared, orange lights blinking through the snow, she felt a flutter of nerves. Tom climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard flecked with gray and melted snowflakes. He waved up at her on the porch as if they'd known each other for years already. "Mary, right," he called, his voice carrying easily through the crisp air. She nodded, hugging her arms around herself, the cold biting through her sweater. Inside the garage, Tom listened to the car with a patient, attentive expression. He leaned close to the engine, hands moving with practiced ease, as if reading a familiar language. "This old girl just doesn't like the cold yet," he said, half to himself, half to Mary. "Can't blame her. These winters are mean until you make peace with them." He straightened, giving Mary a quick, reassuring smile that felt unexpectedly gentle. As he worked, Tom chatted about the town, filling the air with easy stories. He spoke of summer festivals, crowded diners, and quiet trails where the stars felt close. He mentioned Susan once, briefly, saying she always tipped too much and laughed too loud. There was no pity in his voice, only affection, like he was remembering sunshine, not absence. Mary listened, absorbing details of a sister she hadn't really known in this version of her life. That night, the cabin felt even quieter than before, as if holding its breath. Mary sat on the edge of the couch, the bread from Helen Huffington on the table. Crumbs dotted the plate, tiny evidence that her body still remembered hunger. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, testing their resolve with low, steady moans. Shadows from the fireplace logs danced on the walls, though no fire had been lit. She tried turning on the television, hoping noise would distract her from herself. The signal was weak, channels fragmenting into static and ghostly shapes. She landed on a local station replaying a weather report, the anchor cheerful and unconcerned. They talked about snowfall totals and clear skies expected later in the week. Mary turned it off, feeling strangely offended that the world could plan so far ahead. Her eyes drifted to the photo album she had placed on the coffee table earlier. It sat there like a dare, heavy and square, humming with stored time. She opened it slowly, the plastic pages crackling as old photographs caught the light. There were pictures of her and Susan as children, hair tangled, faces smeared with summer dirt. They looked like two halves of the same laughter, impossibly close and effortless. Later pages told a different story, one she recognized but preferred not to read. The sisters stood farther apart, smiles more practiced, their lives branching quietly. Mary's teacher badge hung from her neck in several photos, a small rectangle of identity. Susan's images shifted from city to mountains, from office clothes to hiking gear. Somewhere between those pages, the calls had grown shorter, the visits more rare. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, Mary stared at the faint outline of the ceiling. Sleep refused to come, hovering just out of reach like a word on the tip of her tongue. She replayed their last conversation, every pause, every half-swallowed sentence. She remembered how she had rushed the call, papers to grade, errands to run. She had promised they'd talk longer next time. Certain time would always bend around her. The guilt pressed down on her chest, heavy as the blankets pulled to her chin. Her mind showed her images she had never seen. Susan alone in this cabin, making tea. Susan writing notes in her hiking journal, leaving mugs half-finished on the table. Susan planning to call, to invite, to explain, and then putting it off like Mary did. The difference was that Susan had run out of tomorrows before Mary ran out of excuses. A thought slipped in quietly, almost too soft to acknowledge. Maybe coming here wasn't just about handling paperwork and selling a property. Maybe the mountain, the cabin, and these strangers were holding pieces of a puzzle she'd ignored. But the idea of healing felt like a betrayal, like letting go of the only thing she still shared with Susan. Mary turned onto her side, eyes burning, and waited for a sleep that came without comfort. The entrance to the Silver Ridge Animal Shelter was small and unassuming, a wooden sign swinging gently in the cold wind. Mary hadn't meant to go there. She had only meant to follow the road until her thoughts quieted. But when her car rolled into the small parking lot, something inside her tugged and refused to let her drive past. She stepped out, boots crunching over frost, the smell of hay and winter immediately filling her lungs. For a moment, she simply stood there, unsure why her feet felt more certain than her mind. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her like a borrowed blanket. A volunteer with bright red gloves looked up and offered a smile that was too genuine to ignore. "Can I help you?" the girl asked, but Mary felt the question reach deeper than intended. She hesitated, realizing she had no answer that made sense even to herself. "I just needed to look around," she finally said, voice small but steady. The girl nodded, as if used to people who arrived without explanations. She led Mary toward a row of kennels, the air filled with a mix of barking, whimpering, and hopeful eyes. Dogs pressed noses to metal bars, paws scraping, tails thumping against hard plastic floors. Mary felt something soften inside her, a tiny fracture in the wall she had dragged from Arizona. Loss, recognized loss, even in creatures who couldn't speak it. A beagle with uneven ears barked excitedly when she passed, tail wagging as if he'd been waiting for her. A husky pup pressed itself into the corner, watching with distrust but not fear. But it was the last kennel that made her stop completely, silently, almost painfully. A large black dog lay curled up, ribs faintly visible, eyes dark as wet stone. He didn't look at her at first. He simply breathed, slow and careful, as if every breath cost something. "Shadow," the girl whispered, stepping closer. "He came in a few months ago. Won't let anyone get near. Won't eat unless we leave the room." The dog's ears flicked, just barely, as if acknowledging her presence from far away. Mary knelt slowly, letting her hand hover near the bars but not touching them. Shadow turned his head an inch, just enough for her to see a spark of fear and something else. Mary felt the spark strike something raw inside her. "Hey," she whispered, unsure why her voice shook with a tremor she hadn't invited. The dog blinked, slow and heavy, like someone waking from a memory. For a heartbeat, grief recognized grief, fragile and unspoken between them. The moment passed, but not cleanly. It left a thread Mary couldn't ignore. The volunteer watched silently, then spoke in a gentle tone. "He responds to patience," she said, almost apologetically. Mary nodded, though she wasn't sure whether the girl meant the dog or Mary herself. She rose slowly, dusting off her knees, feeling the weight of the quiet encounter settle inside her. For the first time since arriving, she felt a reason to return somewhere that wasn't her grief. Mary returned to the shelter the next morning, surprised by her own certainty. Frost covered the ground like a thin lace, crunching softly as she crossed the parking lot. Inside, the volunteer from before brightened, as if expecting her. "Shadows in the back today," she said, gesturing toward a quieter hallway. Mary felt her pulse quicken, part anticipation, part fear of wanting something again. The back kennels were quieter, dimly lit, with fewer dogs and fewer distractions. Shadow lay in the same position as before, curled tightly, protecting himself from the world. Mary approached slowly, each step deliberate, as though walking toward a wounded truth. She knelt beside the bars and waited without speaking, letting silence stretch gently. Eventually, the dog lifted his head, eyes wary, but less distant. Mary spoke softly, letting her words flow like warm breath in the cold air. "I know it's hard," she murmured, unsure whether she meant the kennel or life itself. Shatton didn't move closer, but he didn't look away either, and that felt like a victory. She watched the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the tremor of his whiskers. He was scared, guarded, but undeniably alive, and that did something to her. Minutes passed, long and slow, weaving something fragile between them. A volunteer walked by, glancing at Mary with quiet approval before moving on. Shadow shifted slightly, stretching one paw toward the front of the kennel. He didn't touch the bars, but he made himself visible, choosing not to hide. Mary felt her throat tighten at the trust he didn't yet give but no longer denied. She told him about the storm, about the cabin, about her sister's laugh. Her voice quivered only once, and even then, she didn't hide it. Shadow lowered his head, listening in the way only animals can, without judgment. It felt absurd to pour her heart out to a dog who might never let her touch him. But it also felt right, honest, strangely human. When she finally stood, her knees aching from the cold floor, Shadow followed her movement with his eyes, not with hope, not yet, but with recognition, like he had marked her presence as something different. "See you tomorrow," she said, though she hadn't decided that consciously. The dog blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if sealing the promise. Mary stepped out into the cold, carrying a warmth she hadn't expected to find. On the drive back up the mountain, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not joy, not even hope, but a thin thread of purpose pulling gently at her chest. It was small, but it was enough to make her keep breathing through the ache. The mountains rose around her like watchful giants, silent but not unkind. And for the first time, Mary didn't feel entirely alone inside her own story. Helen caught Mary on her way to the mailbox later that afternoon. Snowflakes drifted lazily around them, peaceful despite the cold. "You're coming to the dinner tonight, right?" Helen asked, as if it were a foregone conclusion. Mary froze, clutching the mail she hadn't yet sorted. Social gatherings were the last thing she felt built for. Helen smiled knowingly, reading the hesitation on Mary's face. "It's nothing fancy. Just neighbors, soup, and too many stories," she said. "Besides, people would love to meet Susan's sister." The words stung softly, but not cruelly, just enough to remind Mary of her missing pieces. Still, something in Helen's tone carried warmth instead of expectation. That evening, Mary stood in front of the mirror, holding the same sweater she'd worn for days. She put it on anyway, deciding that effort didn't always require perfection. When she arrived at the community hall, lights spilled out from the windows in warm gold. Laughter drifted into the night air, textured and comforting, like an old quilt. Her nerves buzzed, but she stepped inside. The room was full of life voices, overlapping, chairs scraping, children weaving between tables. A long table offered steaming soups, fresh bread, and pies that smelled like home. Helen waved her over immediately, pulling out a chair at a crowded table. "Everyone, this is Mary," she announced simply. The introduction was gentle, without fanfare, giving Mary room to breathe. Neighbors greeted her with stories instead of questions. A man talked about the early snowfall. A woman laughed about slipping on her porch. Someone mentioned fishing. Someone else joked about burning their holiday roast. The conversation moved like a river, slow and winding, not demanding anything from her. Mary let herself drift in it, surprised by the ease. At one point, Helen placed a bowl of soup in front of her, the steam fogging Mary's glasses. The first spoonful tasted like warmth and something she hadn't felt in months. Helen nudged her elbow gently. "See, not so bad," she teased with a wink. Mary exhaled a soft laugh she didn't recognize at first her own. Later, as people began clearing tables, Mary stepped outside for air. The night sky was clear, stars scattered like distant fires. Her breath rose in white clouds, dissolving into the quiet. She felt lighter, though she couldn't explain why. Something inside had shifted, just enough to make her wonder what might shift next. Mary found herself at Tom's shop the next day, though the car no longer needed attention. She pretended she was there to drop off a thank you note, which she'd written twice and rewritten once more. Tom accepted it with a grin that was too sincere to be polite. "You didn't have to do that," he said, tucking the note into his shirt pocket. Mary shrugged, unsure how to explain the impulse behind it. Tom leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with calm curiosity. "You settling in okay up there in Susan's place?" he asked gently. The question hit deeper than intended, stirring up sediment she had tried to keep buried. Mary hesitated, then admitted, "Some days, I don't know what I'm doing here." Tom nodded, like he had expected the answer. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he reached for a small framed photograph on the shelf behind him. A woman smiled back from the picture, dark hair, bright eyes. This was Emily, Tom said quietly. My wife. Mary's breath caught, the grief in his voice unmistakable. She passed 3 years ago, he added, not looking away from the photo. For a long time, I kept waiting to feel normal again, like the old version of me would just walk back in. He set the frame back down with careful hands. But grief doesn't work like that. You know. Mary felt her eyes sting, her throat tighten. Yes, she whispered, the word carrying more truth than she had shared in months. Tom nodded again, slower this time, like recognizing a familiar language spoken softly. The mountain helped, he said, glancing out toward the window. Walking it, being small, next to something that doesn't break. Mary followed his gaze, imagining the trails Susan had walked, the ones documented in her notebook. Tom's voice softened. If you ever want company on one of those walks, I'm around. It wasn't an invitation to fill a void, but to share space with someone who understood broken edges. Mary felt something inside her lean, not forward, but open. When she left the shop, the air felt sharper, but her breathing came easier. She realized she hadn't felt judged, or pitied, or handled. Tom had simply spoken as one grieving soul to another. The confession lingered with her, warm and heavy, like a stone she didn't mind carrying. For the first time, the town felt like a place she might stay instead of escape. The trailhead was quiet that morning, frost sparkling across the wooden sign. Mary stood at the base of the path, the air cold enough to sting her lungs. She wasn't sure why she had come, maybe Tom's words, maybe Susan's notes, maybe something unnamed. She pulled her scarf tighter, stared up at the narrow path climbing toward the pines. Then she took a step. The ground crunched beneath her boots. The snow, thin but determined, her breath puffed out in uneven clouds, each one carrying a small tremor of effort. The trail wound upward, slowly at first, then with sharper inclines. Mary's legs protested, unused to this kind of climb. Her heart pounded harder than she liked to admit. Halfway up, she paused, leaning against a boulder cold enough to sting her palms. The forest around her was impossibly still, a quiet so deep it felt sacred. A bird called once, its sound echoing across the frozen branches. Her breath hitched, not from exertion but from something breaking open inside. She closed her eyes, and grief flooded her without warning. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that clawed its way up. But it escaped anyway, raw, cracked, the kind of sound she had swallowed for too long. It echoed off the trees, swallowed quickly by the mountain's wide silence. Mary cried until the cold numbed her cheeks and her lungs burned. For a moment, she felt ashamed of the outburst. Then a softer realization settled in, as quiet as fresh snow. This wasn't weakness. It was release, rough, overdue, honest. The mountain wasn't judging her. It wasn't holding anything against her. It simply held space for her to unravel. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her face with trembling hands. She looked up toward the trail's next bend, still steep, still daunting, but it didn't feel impossible anymore. She took another step forward, not because she felt strong, but because she wasn't finished, because something inside her had shifted just enough to keep going. As she descended later, the world looked slightly different. Not brighter, not gentler, just clearer, like frost melted from a window pane. She didn't know what waited in the next days or weeks, but she knew she would return to this path again and again if needed. Healing hurt, but for the first time, the hurt felt meaningful. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, cutting the room into warm and cold stripes. Mary had been searching drawers for a misplaced flashlight when her fingers brushed a thin envelope. It was wedged beneath a stack of maps, edges yellowed, her name written in Susan's familiar curve. Her breath hitched, the room growing too still as she held the envelope like it might crumble. For a long moment, she simply sat on the floor, hands trembling, unable to open it. When she finally tore the flap, the sound felt too loud, too final. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, creased from waiting. Susan's handwriting filled the page steady, soft, unmistakably hers. Mary's eyes hovered over the first words, heart thudding against her ribs. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if she could jump. "Mary, I miss you," the letter began, simple and disarming. Susan wrote of childhood summers, of late-night talks, of a time before silence grew between them. She wrote about regret, not accusations, not blame, only the tender ache of distance. She admitted she had wanted to call, to visit, to say everything out loud. but she hadn't known how to bridge the years they had both let stack up. Mary pressed the page to her chest, tears spilling without resistance. She could almost hear Susan's voice, steady and warm, reading the words aloud. The letter spoke of forgiveness, quiet and unconditional, offered without expectation. It spoke of love that hadn't vanished even when the calls had. It spoke of hope that someday Mary would stand on the mountain and feel whole again. The weight of unsaid things pressed down on her, but not like before. This weight was softer, like a quilt laid over her shoulders instead of a stone on her spine. She wiped her cheeks, though the tears kept coming, warm and relentless. The letter didn't fix everything, but it unknotted something tightly wound inside her, something she hadn't known how to loosen alone. When she folded the page again, she did so gently, reverently. She placed it on the nightstand, aware that it had changed the shape of the room. The air felt different now, less sharp, more breathable. She looked out the window at the distant trail Susan used to walk. For the first time, it didn't feel like a path she was intruding on. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, the letter close at hand. A quiet certainty formed inside her, fragile but unmistakable. She didn't just want to stay in Silver Ridge. She needed to. Not to escape the past, but to finally meet it without fear. And in that small, steady shift, the world widened just a little. The storm rolled in without warning, swallowing the sky in a gray, churning mass. Wind rattled the cabin windows, sounding like a restless animal trying to get in. Mary stood at the door, watching snow whip sideways across the yard. Lightning flickered, brief and sharp, illuminating the pines like bones. Then came a crash, distant, heavy, unmistakably wrong. She grabbed her coat without thinking, instinct taking over where fear hesitated. The moment she stepped outside, the wind shoved against her, cold and merciless. She forced her way down the path toward Helen's house, boots sinking deep into drifts. The snow blinded her, stinging her cheeks and finding its way beneath her scarf. But she kept going, propelled by something fierce and urgent. As she reached the porch, she found Helen struggling with a broken shutter. "Helen!" Mary shouted over the wind, gripping her arm to steady her. The older woman's face was flushed from the cold, breath coming in quick bursts. "The power's out," Helen said, voice shaking slightly. "We need to check on the neighbors. Some of them can't get around easily." Mary nodded, feeling adrenaline replace hesitation. They moved from house to house, knocking on doors, offering blankets and reassurance. Snow soaked Mary's hair, clinging to her lashes, but she barely noticed. A fallen branch had shattered a shed window, and they worked together to board it. Their fingers stiffened from the cold, but they pressed on, tireless and determined. At one cabin, an elderly man struggled to light candles with shaking hands. Mary stepped in, striking the match and holding it steady until the flame caught. The soft glow filled the room, pushing the darkness into corners. The man thanked her, his voice quivering with relief. Mary felt warmth spread through her, not from the candle, but from purpose. Hours passed before the storm finally eased its grip on the town. Mary and Helen trudged back up the hill, exhaustion settling deep in their bones. The sky was quiet now, heavy clouds drifting like slow-moving ships. Breaths came in visible puffs, mingling with the fading wind. Mary felt lighter than she had in months, despite the weight of snow on her coat. Inside her cabin, she peeled off her wet layers and sat by the window. The world outside glistened under the faint glow of emergency lanterns. She thought of how she had moved tonight without fear, without freezing. She had acted, helped, comforted, become someone useful again. Someone she had lost track of but never fully stopped being. The next morning, the shelter was buzzing with post-storm activity. Volunteers shoveled walkways, cleared fallen branches, mended fencing. Mary arrived with sore muscles but a steady heart, drawn by an urge she didn't question. Inside, the warm smell of animals and hay wrapped around her like welcome. Shadow's kennel sat at the end of the hall, quiet as always. When she approached, Shadow lifted his head immediately. Not slow, not hesitant, immediate. His dark eyes found hers with a clarity she hadn't seen before. Mary knelt down, feeling a soft flutter in her chest. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, voice warmer than the air around them. Shadow shifted, uncurling his long limbs. He stood, shook himself, and took one step forward, then another. His nose pressed gently against the bars, close enough to fog the metal with breath. Mary froze, overwhelmed by the fragile enormity of the moment. She extended her hand, slow and careful, letting her fingers hover. Shadow leaned in, sniffing her knuckles with cautious certainty. Then he rested his chin against her hand, a small weight that felt like a revelation. Mary's breath caught, tears gathering without warning. He had chosen this moment. He had chosen her. A volunteer walking by stopped, eyes widening. "Wow," she whispered, hand flying to her mouth. "He's never done that. Not once. Not with anyone." Mary stroked Shadow's chin gently, afraid to move too fast. The dog closed his eyes, trusting her in a way that felt holy. The world seemed to narrow to this one fragile connection. All the noise of the shelter faded into a soft hum around them. Mary felt something inside her unlock, a quiet click she hadn't expected. She wasn't replacing anything or anyone. She was simply receiving the trust offered to her. When she finally stood, Shadow watched her with steady eyes, not pleading, not afraid, just present, anchored in her presence. Mary wiped her cheeks, unable to contain her smile. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised softly. Shadow's tail thumped once, a slow, certain beat full of meaning. The morning of the hike dawned clear and bitterly cold. Mary met Tom at the trailhead, their breath forming white clouds in the air. He carried a thermos of coffee and an extra pair of gloves, which he handed her without ceremony. She took them, grateful for the unspoken kindness. The mountain loomed above them, vast and steep, waiting. The first stretch of the trail was quiet, except for crunching snow. Trees stood tall around them, branches glittering with frost. Tom walked at her pace, neither rushing nor slowing too much. The silence between them felt comfortable, earned. Mary let the rhythm of their steps settle her heartbeat. Halfway up, the trail narrowed, winding between jagged rocks. Mary paused, breath visible, chest tight with a familiar ache. Tom turned, his expression patient and knowing. "You're doing great," he said simply, no pressure in the words. Mary nodded, though her eyes stung from more than the cold. She looked out over the valley, white and endless beneath them. The world felt huge, larger than her regrets, larger than her guilt. "I wasn't there for her," Mary whispered, the confession escaping before she could stop it. Tom stepped closer but didn't touch her, respecting the space of the admission. "Maybe not in the way you wish," he said softly. "But love isn't measured only in moments we get right." The wind swept around them, carrying the sharp scent of pine. Mary felt the truth of his words settle in her like warmth. She breathed deeply, letting the cold air clear the tightness in her chest. She wasn't forgiving herself yet, not fully. But she was closer than she had ever been. They continued upward, the trail growing steeper, the sky brightening. At one point, Tom slipped, and Mary instinctively grabbed his arm. He laughed, a short, startled sound that warmed the air between them. Mary found herself smiling, truly smiling, without forcing it. The mountain didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like possibility. When they reached the final stretch, Tom let her go ahead. "You finished this part on your own," he said, voice steady. Mary hesitated, then nodded, stepping forward alone. Her legs ached, her breath came hard, but she kept moving. Each step felt like laying down one stone of the wall she had carried. Mary reached the summit just as the first light broke over the horizon. The sky shifted from deep blue to soft gold, spreading warmth across the snow. She stood still, breath-catching at the sight unfolding before her. It felt like the world was waking with her, slow and tender. Tom arrived moments later, stopping a respectful distance behind her. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows behind the rocks. Mary closed her eyes, letting the light touch her face. She imagined Susan beside her, laughing, fearless, alive. The grief surged, but this time it didn't hollow her out. It filled her, warm and steady, like love remembered. She unfolded the letter she had brought, smoothing its creases carefully. The wind tugged at the edges, but she held it firm, grounded. She read the words again, each one sinking deeper than before. Then she whispered out loud, "I'm here, Susan, and I'm trying." The mountain carried her voice gently, as if listening. When she folded the letter again, she pressed it to her chest. A soft peace settled around her shoulders, neither heavy nor light. It felt like permission to live, to hope, to keep choosing tomorrow. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a scar healing in the warmth of a new day. She turned to Tom, who watched her with quiet understanding. No words were needed, not yet, not here. He simply nodded once, a gesture of solidarity. Mary nodded back, feeling something inside her align. She was no longer carrying everything alone. As they began the descent, Mary glanced back at the summit one last time. The sun glowed brightly now, chasing shadows across the snow. She breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs with clarity. "I think I'm staying," she said, the words calm and certain. Tom smiled, the kind of smile that welcomed a beginning. When they reached the trailhead, Mary paused. The town lay below, small and waiting, full of doors she hadn't opened yet. Shadow would be expecting her. Helen would stop by with bread, and Mary would meet each day with a heart no longer hiding in edges. For the first time in years, she felt ready to live forward, not backward.